Boys, girls, ladies, gents, welcome back to another video. Not a stream. Don't hit me with that. So today we're going to be talking about budget pairings. I feel like this is not the most complicated topic, but I get asked like quite often, you know, I have X commander doing X thing. What should I do next? This is kind of, I guess, more of a transitionary guide than anything, because I mean, truly like budget pairings and other KVKs. I mean, like KVK 1, like you might have like a 5-1-1-1 Richard and a Sun Tzu or something. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about like what are the minimums you can run in Season of Conquest and what are budget pairings that you could be comfortable with and feel okay with running. If you guys are brand new here, I play a whole bunch of rock. I am free to play. I have a lot of kill points, I guess, and those are my credentials. If you guys enjoy the channel, if you guys enjoy the content, please make sure to sub, hit that notification button, hit the like button, all that good stuff. If you guys want to send anything to the PO box, like I don't know, a t-shirt with your jumper group on, something like that, or some snacks or whatever, PO box is in the description below. We're gonna do a video on that whole thing, and make sure you join that Discord. With all my plugging out of the way, budget pairings. So the first thing, before I get into the pairings themselves, we're gonna say, like, why would you want to run a budget pair? So if you are playing this game, we just had a video about consolidation that might be like a couple videos ago. We had a video about consolidation versus when would you want to go wide and have a bunch more marches. Generally, you'd want to run a budget pair if, number one, this is your first pairing, you just got to Season of Conquest, and you need one march to put on the field. If that's a budget pairing, that's okay. It's gonna be way better than whatever epics you have playing in the junk drawer. You want some kind of like new meta prime commander at the bare minimum. So running a budget pair for your first march is pretty good, and then after that you have to consider, do I want to consolidate on this march or do I want to go wide into other marches? Not super complicated to why you'd want to run a budget pair if it's your first. If it's your second or third marches, maybe it is really important that you get the debuffs out there, maybe you've got a lot of resources, a lot of speeds, and you're just trying to make sure that you can get more value out of your time. And that might mean that you need more marches, and some of those marches might be budget pairings. Budget pairings are generally for people transitioning directly into Season of Conquest that are trying to get as many marches out as possible. What does a budget pair mean? A budget pair doesn't mean that it is necessarily a bad pairing. It's going to superficially look good. So a really, really ghetto budget pair, if you had a really rough landing in a Season of Conquest, could look something like a 5-5-1-1 Scipio with a expertise Ethelflaed. That is obviously hot garbage, right? You're not trying to find yourself fielding that. However, you would need to field that over nothing. So budget pairing is generally something that is not necessarily horrible, but we'll say suboptimal, right? Scipio, if you run him at 5-5-5-1, is a very strong commander. His fourth skill is generally really important for when you have 3 marches. So if you don't have 3 marches, just running him as a 5-5-5-1 is a budget option. Instead of costing the 700 sculptures to expertise him, it would only cost 390, and you get the vast majority of what you're looking for. With Scipio, that's not a huge issue, because at 5-5-5-1, he does most of the things you need to do. When you look at a commander like Boudica, at 5-5-5-1, she basically does everything you need her to do. There's not a huge reason to go past that. So technically we could call her a budget march because she works well on a budget. However, it's not a budget march as in like there's not a huge reason to do this later. A commander that's not the case with would be a commander like Nevsky. Nevsky at 5-5-1-1 or 5-5-5-1 are excellent options. He's an excellent commander on the field. However, you definitely want to expertise Nevsky. He does a whole lot of awesome extra stuff. There are commanders that you run in a budget that you don't have to play an expertise, and there are commanders on a budget where you really have to expertise them at a certain point, and you're just trying to get out, let's say, 3 marches. 3 is generally the magic number, whether that be 2 infantry, 1 cav, 1 cav, 1 imp, 1 archer, or 2 cav, 1 inf. As long as you can get out a couple marches, you're in a really, really good spot. When I say a couple, I mean generally 3. Past 3 is generally where your cost effectiveness starts to nosedive because you're simply trying to take on too many tasks. However, at 3 marches, especially 1 cav, 1 imp, 1 archer, you're getting value out of all your armaments, you're getting value out of a lot of your gear, and you're completing a lot of the minimums that you wouldn't otherwise do. That's why you'd run a budget pair. That is what a budget pair is, and now we're gonna look at some other stuff. Something that you may hear people say is a phrase called backwards investing. This is going to give context to overall why you'd be running budget pairings, because budget pairings don't necessarily mean that they're just budgeted prime commanders, right? Your primaries may be budgeted prime commanders. However, your secondaries are going to be some kind of amalgam of meta commanders that are either half invested in or older commanders that generally don't have use. A good example of this would be Alexander the Great. So sometimes people may find themselves running Scipio in KVK 3, but they may be running Scipio at like a 5-5-1-1, and they'll be running a 5-5-1-1 Scipio because they expertised Alex, or maybe they put him at like 5-5-5-1 or something like that, which is obviously a mistake in hindsight. However, they already did it, they have the commander, and they need to move forward. Another example of this could be like an expertise Charles Martel and maybe LC Charles Martel. Generally not something I would look for. Honestly, not even something I would suggest in a budget march, but if you already have Charles Martel and you only have like 190 sculptures for LC, not the worst. It's not the worst. I wouldn't run it personally, but I see why you would, because you have had these old, now expired commanders, we'll call them. Another good example of this would be like Minamoto or Mehmed. Like Minamoto or maybe Saladin or something like that. Like these are commanders that generally are no longer good. However, you may still have some value in just out the fact that you have them and they're slightly better than having nothing. Generally, you wouldn't want to invest in these commanders once you've gotten to Season of Conquest, but if you've gotten to Season of Conquest and you have, say, a YSG, say an Alex, say a Mina, say a Mehmed, right? We want to put those commanders to work. Another thing is going to be, why would you want to run many marches? We talked about this a little bit with a budget pair, but again, the more marches you have, the more value you get off your debuffs, right? So if Nevsky's doing a debuff for 45% health, Boudica's doing a debuff for your opponent taking 35% more skill damage, Scipio's doing a debuff to where they take 30% reduced health. Maybe if you have Ethelfled, she's doing like more debuffs that are kind of redundant at this point. But anyway, point is, you're doing a whole bunch of debuffs. The more debuffs you can get on the field, the more damage your consolidated marches do. Even if you had, say, a really solid Nevsky and a really solid Scipio, you may want to run a weaker Boudica, let's say a 5-5-1-1 Boudica with a 5-5-1-1 ZL, because you really want Boudica's ability to land, so then your Scipio and Nevsky can do a lot more work. That could be reasonable. Could be a reasonable thing to put on many marches. Or maybe you want the march to like donkey on a dagger. When I say donkey, it just means it's going to take bad trades, but at least going to debuff your opponent, so fine. Again, budget marches are going to be useful for running more marches or running your first march. Running multiple marches might be better because you want more kills for your time and you have more resources and speeds. And, you know, that's going to be why we go deeper into this. The final thing it's going to be useful for is because if you have bad investments in the past, or you just have investments period, like YSG, Mina, Alex, you're going to have commanders that you want to pull out of your bench and you want to put on the field. Not in every single case are you going to be able to put every commander out of your bench, especially if you're playing like in Orleans KVK, where maybe some of these commanders should stay on your bench and they should function as auxiliary skills. There are some cases where you wouldn't want to pull them out. In most cases, you probably want to find a way to integrate them into your main marches, just so you can save the sculptures that you would normally use for secondaries and put them elsewhere. So we're going to run examples of budget pairs for 4 different commanders. These commanders are going to be Scipio, Nevsky, Boudica, and QB. So I'm going to go through these 4. I might talk about a couple other that come to mind towards the end. These 4 commanders are generally commanders that you should be looking to budget, just because they're early on commanders that are probably worth it. Scipio. Scipio generally should not be touching the field outside of 5-5-5-1+. His expertise specifically is not super duper important, because if you don't have Guan, and Guan is not going in a budget build, if you don't have Guan, it's much less useful. However, his 4 skill is really, really good. We really like his 4 skill, especially if we have 3 marches, and 3 marches is kind of the magic number. So to open up, you might have him at a 5-5-5-1, and then later on, you may get his 4 skill once you finish a lot of your other marches. An example of some budget pairings would be like Scipio and YSG expertise. YSG is actually still an amazing commander in Season of Conquest, and as a secondary to Scipio, basically nobody's attacking Scipio, and YSG just does a ton of damage. So if you have YSG and you have Scipio, that's an excellent first march. A super budget march, especially if you're running something at their bare minimums, like Scipio, running Scipio Ethelfled is not horrible. I've seen this march work in the past. This is generally with people who had ill-prepared accounts entering KVK3, and they're looking for anything they can do. 190 sculptures into Scipio, expertise Ethelfled, you could run it with the double relic, and it does okay. Something a little better than that would be something like Scipio Mehmed. Scipio Mehmed works pretty well. Again, you'd want to have Scipio at least a 5-5-5-1, but if you have to have it at a minimum 5-5-1-1, I understand it can work. If you have a 5-5-5-1 Alex, or better, running Alex as a secondary to Scipio is not a bad idea as a single march. It makes him a very strong duelist, and he can poke very well. It's not something I'd recommend the more marches you get. I just don't like Alex that much in this current meta, unless Alex was a primary to LC. But again, that wouldn't be a budget pairing. That'd be expertise Alex as a primary to LC, also expertise, because LC's expertise is what makes him good with Alex. So again, Scipio Alex is pretty good, but eventually you're gonna want to swap off of that in the long haul. Maybe into Scipio Mehmed, Scipio YSG is fine. Now, another budget march would be Scipio and LC himself. LC at a 5-5-1-1 is actually an awesome commander, right? He's hitting 5 marches for 2250 smite damage. Smite damage is not affected by skill damage, but that's okay because Scipio has the support tree, so he fires out a whole ton of abilities, and his primary ability reduces their health by 30%. So Scipio goes off, LC goes off. This is an awesome amount of damage being done. The March speed reduction is also awesome. Over here, his second skill is literally just amazing. It's just so good for so many reasons. 5511, his third skill is not too great. His fourth skill is pretty good. Expertise is awesome. But at 190 sculptures, he's an awesome budget pairing as a secondary to Scipio. However, remember, with all these budget pairings, can you run Scipio to 5511? Can you run him at a 5551? Yes, and yes, eventually you do want to expertise him. Nevsky, awesome commander. He can probably be fielded at 5511. He really should be fielded at least 5551. And the reasons why we say this is just like extra defense is awesome, but the extra damage dealt is awesome. Like just so good for so many reasons. It's also really cool because his third ability is just dastardly when put into effect with literally any other amounts of commanders. If somebody's attacking you, you just attack them with all your marches, you take less damage. Can't hate on it. Anyway, if you are going to be running Nevsky, I generally don't want to see Nevsky being run outside of a 5551 capacity. I want to see 5551 Nevsky with an Expertise Minamoto. Expertise Minamoto, I call it a budget pairing. Generally, if Mina is 5515, I might be comfortable with it as long as his last skill is 5 and he's got his double relic. Nevsky Mina is an absolutely awesome march. When you first start out, if you want to run Nevsky Mina and QB Joan, those are fine 2 march to open up with if you want to run just a bunch of cav, right? So let's say in KVK 1 and 2, like you had Minamoto Chao, and then you translated that into like Mina Chao, Scipio Ethel, right? Now you have 2 sets of cav marches and you're coming to Season of Conquest and you're like, I have to run multiple marches, but I don't know what to do. I don't have that many sculptures, right? You pull maybe your Saladin off your bench for a little bit and run like Saladin Ethel while you're running Nevsky Mina, right? And then once you can afford the QB and Joan, then you take the Saladin away and you put the QB and Joan on. Again, when you're running a lot of budget pairings though, it is important to note that like if you're going to run Saladin Ethel in Season of Conquest, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but if you were to run it, you need Saladin's Museum, you need Ethel's double museum, and then you need a double relic Minamoto. So that's 5 relics right there, not counting like anything else you touch. So I'd be a little careful with that. Another good one would be like Nevsky Mehmed. I'm not saying Nevsky Mehmed is anywhere near as good as Nevsky Mina, but if you don't have access to Mina, Mehmed with his double relic is a very, very fine choice. Again, he's a little slower than Minamoto is going to be, a lot slower if I'm being fair, but he's going to pack a punch and he's going to be kind of tanky. So I wouldn't be too concerned about it, but it's not something you want permanently. Another thing that I've seen run, I've never done it myself, but I've heard about, is Nevsky YSG. It's pretty good for the same reasons why Scipio YSG is pretty good, except it's going to get targeted more, so it's a little worse. But again, anything you can run early game, you need at least 1 march. So if that 1 march is Nevsky or Scipio, then run it with whatever you got, run it with your best. Ideally, the one you'd want to run it with is a 5115 Joan. Joan is really strong. All you really need is her last skill to 5, so her probability goes from 50% to 100%. If you can do that, you're in an awesome spot. I would like to let it be known that if you can run a Nevsky 5551 and a Joan 5115, you're in an awesome spot. Like, you're good. The only issue is getting this last skill to 5 is generally going to require like 5 to like 10 skill resets, right? Depending on how lucky you are. As long as her third skill is like bottomed out at 1 or 2, you're in a good spot. If her first skill is good, her second skill is good, her fourth skill is good. The first skill is mandatory, the fourth skill is mandatory. The second skill, if you get it, cool. If you don't, cool. Nevsky Joan is eventually what you want. If you can get it for a budget, cool. If you can't get it for a budget, it happens. Again, can you run Nevsky at a 5511? Yes. Can you run it as a 5551? Yes. You need to expertise Nevsky. So next is going to be Boudica. I've seen 2 budget pairings for Boudica, or 3 actually. So Boudica can be run at a 5511. I prefer to have her at 5551 because I think she's going to generally get targeted, and having skill damage taken reduction is pretty important. Personally, I would suggest a 5551 Boudica, and you can run that with YSG. You can run that with a 5511 Zhuge Liang. That's also a very good pairing. Zhuge Liang is a commander, again, similar to Nevsky, to where every one of his skills is absolutely awesome. So 5511 Zhuge Liang is generally going to do most of the things you're looking for. However, if you can run it 5551 or expertise him, you're in a really good spot. He should generally be expertise before Boudica is even considered to be expertise. Boudica, when I say she can be 5511 or she can be 5551, Boudica should generally not be brought above 5551 unless you're running Boudica with Artemisia, which you shouldn't be doing if you're watching this video. So Boudica YSG is decent, Boudica Zhuge Liang, decent. You know, obviously Boudica Zhuge Liang is the final march. You eventually want to have both of those commanders at really good spots. Zhuge Liang expertise, Boudica at a 5551, but they're decent at a 5511 Boudica and a 5511 Zhuge Liang. They are functional. Another one that I've seen is a 5511 Boudica or a 5551 Boudica ran with an Ethelfled. I personally haven't run it. I don't see it very often, but again, the double relic Ethelfled is quite strong. The last commander that I'll look at a little bit is, I will say, QB. So QB is a very strong commander. He has a lot of synergy with a commander called William the First. William the First is a great pairing with him. However, you don't need that pairing immediately until you have like 4 or 5 marches. You can run QB and William if you want to, with QB being like a 5-5-5-1. All of QB's skills are awesome. His expertise is questionable. Personally, I'd rather have him at a 5-5-5-5 without the expertise, but some people like the expertise better. Me personally, I don't. Having him at 5-5-5-1 is pretty good. His 4 skill is awesome. His expertise is questionable. It doesn't make him bad as a 5-5-5-5, but 5-5-5-1 QB, pretty good. And then you can run William at a 5-5-1-1 with him. William's skills are not necessarily bad, but William's active skill is what makes him so good. When he hits somebody with his active skill, it means that their extra skill damage from buffs can't take effect. So William, who has like plus 60% from skill buffs, is gone. Twilight Falls is gone. Wedge Formation is gone. Hunter buff is gone. Combo is gone. The entire skill tree is gone. William is a very strong commander. So having him at 5-5-1 is really okay, because the only things you really care about William is that he's firing skills. His second skill is just really strong, and you know, for an extra like 130 sculptures, you really want that. Anyway, next, QB and Mehmed. If you are running Nevsky Mina or Nevsky Joan and you are investing in QB second and you need a secondary for QB and you just don't have one yet, Mehmed is totally fine. Mehmed with double relic is honestly just kind of a monstrous commander. I mean, he really doesn't look super assuming. Like, I know these stats look pretty low, but Mehmed with a extra 30% health and 10% skill damage does put in a considerable amount of work. I've seen QB Mehmed work, and it's pretty good. Another thing is if you have Mina. So you're running Nevsky Mina, and you have QB, and you're 5-1-1-5 Joan. Nevsky, Mina, QB, Joan works pretty well. I've heard that QB Joan, I've just seen it work well in general. Like, if you wanted to run the Nevsky with the William and the QB Joan, they have great synergy, they're pretty strong. Should not be afraid to run that. Of course, Nevsky should still be your first investment as a cavalry, and Joan should be your second. But if you find yourself with a Joan and a QB on your bench, putting them together is not such a bad idea. Again, QB can be ran as a 5-5-5-1, but eventually you want to run him as a 5-5-5-5 or an expertise. Again, there are a whole ton of budget options in this game, from a 5-5-1-5 Henry to a 5-5-1-1 Artemisia to a 1-1-1-5 Tommyrus, right? That sounds super ghetto. Or a 5-1-1-1 Trajan. Like, I've seen a whole bunch, 5-5-1-1 Heracles. I've seen a whole bunch of super ghetto budget marches on the field and putting in work. These were just examples of 4 of them that I thought were pretty popular, that I think are going to be most applicable to the vast majority of players. Of course, there are a ton more. There just aren't a ton more that I would personally suggest that people run. Again, guys, if you guys didn't know, I do coaching. It's $35 a session for an on-stream. It's $75 for a session off-stream. If you guys want to check that out, you guys can go to the Discord in the description below. But generally, I go through stuff like this where I talk about what kind of pairing should you be running, where should you be putting your gear, where should you be putting your sculptures, and how to make, you know, budget or consolidated pairings and why you should do so. These are not all the pairings. These are just some of the ones that I like. These are the reasons why I would run budget pairings, and these are, you know, what they are in general. If you guys enjoy content like this, please drop a like, consider subscribing, hitting the notification bell. If you guys want to help support the channel, again, we have a Streamlabs link in the description below. Donations there always help an absolute ton. And again, guys, thank you so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and I hope this video helped.